Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk to Director Webster Uzbekistan in Tashkent, Anthony Jarvis. First of all, thank you very much for the interview, for some international information about the Webster University as well as the food safety maybe. Today it's very important and many have problems in the not only Uzbekistan but maybe in the world. So, but first of all, we want to speak about the university life, maybe the students. It's very interesting. Okay, you can speak about.
Webster is such an unusual presence in Tashkent and Uzbekistan generally. It has some really critical and unique features. One of which is that it's an American degree, and it's important. So I remember talking to a friend who ran the Paris Graduate School of Management some years ago, and she said her graduates were unemployable if they didn't have three things. If they didn't have an internationally recognised degree, if they didn't have English, and if they didn't have a study abroad experience. So one of the things that Webster offers in Uzbekistan is all three of those things. We teach in English, but we also help develop students' English along the way. So it's not just the degree program, whatever it might be. There's also a fair amount of assistance to develop competence in English. And the second is we have an extraordinary study abroad program. So we can send students to Greece, to Leiden in the Netherlands, Vienna in Austria, Geneva in Switzerland, or any of the US campuses as well. Excuse me. Or even our new campus in Tbilisi in Georgia.
Yeah.
So that's important for a number of reasons, because that international experience is really critical in developing a global perspective. And so that's one of the things we aim to do. Why is it important, and why does Webster matter in that regard? It's because the students that Webster takes will have careers well beyond Uzbekistan. They will work in New York or London or Geneva or Paris. This is a global generation. And Uzbekistan has a cohort of students incredibly talented, incredibly ambitious.
Yes.
And what we see ourselves as contributing to is the national project, which is to develop those students, give them a global perspective, send them out into the world, and then bring that back to Uzbekistan. Bring that talent and experience, because as much opportunity as there is globally, a lot of the opportunity is here. This is a rapidly growing country, and the most important thing for a rapidly growing country is talent, but curated talent that's been trained and is creative, and so that's what we see ourselves as doing here, and I can tell you that's what the faculty and my colleagues see ourselves as doing here, and so far it has been a wonderful experience, extraordinary students, and worthy work. So I think Webster is fully committed to the Uzbek national project, and we're very happy to be part of it.
Without any doubt, yes. Actually, we have many talented students in Uzbekistan, especially some of them are in the Webster University. Yes, nowadays. So there are many students want to learn and get some skills about the biodiversity.
Yes.
And another like that fields. So we know today, actually, you have run a global seminar program in London, research projects at the United Nations. Yeah, we know. The climate change, lack of weather and natural resources, socio-economic consequences of the pandemic, maybe under the influence of such factors, the issue of food security has become one of the most urgent problems in the world. So what do you think about it, maybe?
It's an interesting question,
Yes.
and it's a critical question. I started life as an historian, and so I tend to look at these things in historical perspective. One of the difficulties for global food security actually arises in the 19th century, and it comes with the industrialisation of agriculture, the shift to mechanised agriculture, the reliance on monocrops, the reliance on hydrocarbon-based fertilisers, and as increasingly mechanisation becomes a critical feature, and also the Green Revolution in terms of genetic manipulation of crops, the system has become more fragile, more stretched, and more difficult to maintain. On top of that, agriculture as an economic practice is increasingly unreliable. So look at it this way: if you track global food prices in real terms, they have dropped consistently through the 19th and 20th centuries. They've only risen twice in real terms. The first spike is during the First World War, and the next spike is during the Second World War. And that gives us some clues about the dangers that the world faces. So we've turned agriculture into a commodity. So we export food. We've often, in many countries, diminished the capacity to produce food. So think, for example, of Egypt. Egypt fed itself for 6,000 years. It was the grain basket of Africa and of Europe in many ways. It exported vast surpluses. What did they do? They dammed the Nile at the Aswan. They stopped the Nile flooding, yes. And they built houses on the best arable land in Egypt. Egypt now is unable to feed itself because it has progressively destroyed the most fertile arable land available, and it's now a net importer. In fact, it's heavily reliant on food aid and the purchase of food. Now, what happens if you can't get it? And that leads us to other clues. You mentioned at the beginning climate. The other thing is the pandemic, COVID-19, but also on top of that, war. So if we think about all three of those things, in the last 10 years, we've seen a number of really dramatic climate events, climate shifts, climate change, which have wreaked havoc on global production. The country I come from, Australia, the loss of fertile land through bushfires, through drought, has become increasingly problematic, which reduces production. So you've got climate change, which also means sometimes you just don't have the water resources, a really important issue in Uzbekistan. Increasing desertification, the loss of fertile cropland to desert and salination is an incredibly important problem. On top of that, you then have what emerged in COVID-19 was a remarkably, in some ways we didn't know. We tended to think the global supply chain was very robust. But what COVID-19 showed us was how quickly it could collapse, and how quickly, once we were cut off from global lines of trade and supply, how very difficult life could become. And that none more so in the question of food. And on top of that, the thing that spiked food prices in the 20th century, First World War, Second World War, Ukraine. Ukraine was a major producer of wheat. So war does two things. It upsets the supply chain. It takes food producers out of the system. It also does other things. It means it raises the price of the factors of production. So modern agriculture relies heavily on hydrocarbon-based fertilisers. What happened during the initial period of both the Gulf War, the war in Ukraine, spikes in the prices of oil, which meant the energy used for mechanised production and the cost of fertiliser production skyrockets, so that the cost of food goes up. Now, that then creates global differentials because some countries can afford it and some countries can't. The general rule is the poorer you are, the greater the percentage of your income you spend on food. So if your monthly income is, say, $500 a month, so something like $125 a week, you may be spending 30 or 40% of your monthly income on food. In general, the cost of food as a percentage tends to be much higher when you're poor. And of course, you don't eat that much more. You might eat slightly better food or more expensive food. But in general, as you become more prosperous, the amount you spend on food decreases as a percentage of your income. So what that means is you're less susceptible to food shock or price increases. The problem in Uzbekistan is compounded by a number of perverse developments. One is climate change, and the fragility of water resources. We know what happened with the Aral Sea. We know that that water resources are becoming increasingly difficult to manage in Uzbekistan.
Actually, in fact, in 2025, nearly 3 million people are suffer from for the lack of weather in the Central Asia.
Yes,
countries.
yes.
It's very.
It's a significant significant issue. But let's add another complicating factor. The population of Uzbekistan is growing at the rate of about 0.6 of a million per year. So you're adding every year you're adding 600,000 people who need to be fed, who need to be clothed. So you have an increasingly fragile food supply, but you have a rapidly growing population. So the demand for food increases. The issue in Uzbekistan is much less supply. It's really affordability. So in general, food crises are not that often about is food available? The real crisis is can you afford it? However, I think that used to be how we would think about food security globally. But there are other issues running. Farm yields, the question of water, not just population increase, climate change, and supply chain. So it's not just that there's population growth and increased demand. It may be that for the first time, supply is fragile enough for us to be concerned about whether there is enough food. There's another complication, which is how we manage agriculture as an economic commodity. So if we think about how agriculture is managed in North America, particularly in the European Union, one of the problems of agriculture is the instability of food prices. So while food prices have generally declined over the 20th century, it's highly variable. So if you're relying primarily on agriculture, you have very unpredictable income and international income. And so many countries, if they have the resources, are tempted to subsidise agriculture. So the European Union has done it historically through the Common Agricultural Policy and has spent billions and billions of dollars subsidising agriculture. The US has done the same, particularly with corn and soy and other grain crops. Japan has done the same. Australia has resisted the temptation, but there are still some hidden tariff subsidies in Australia. What that means is the market is distorted. It means that the highly subsidised food production in Europe and North America means that it's more difficult for agricultural producers in Africa and in Central Asia to run their agricultural sectors profitably because they must compete with commodities and items that are being exported from countries that massively subsidise agriculture. For example, the US provides more subsidy to a corn producer than the corn actually costs to produce. So that corn producer could sell that 100 tonnes of corn for nothing, and they will still be making money through the subsidy process. Now, there have been some reforms there, but as a principle, it makes life very difficult for agricultural producers in Africa, Central Asia, and Latin America.
Yes, you are right.
I'm sorry, I'm giving you a lot of information.
No, actually, unfortunately, I understand the many the problems in the system, especially in Uzbekistan. No problem. Actually, Mr. Jarvis, how is the food safety controlled in the country, actually?
In Uzbekistan?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. It's I have to say the Uzbek government has an unenviable task. But generally, I think it's managed it very well, because if you think about, there have been a number of issues that Uzbekistan has had to face, particularly with the war in Ukraine, the increase in energy prices, the influx of a large number of refugees, Russian and others, pushing up prices and putting pressure on housing
Yes.
and resources. And of course, once you have a population that moves in with more liquid income, it naturally produces forms of inflation. So one of the things that the Uzbek government has had to deal with is not just the influx of a large population who are relatively wealthy, hence pushing up prices, particularly for food, but pushing up demand. On top of that, they've had to deal with increasing energy prices, increasing prices for fertiliser, and then also how do you manage water resources. So it's an extraordinarily difficult task. That said, the Uzbek government has done very well with very carefully targeted food security issues. So in general, while food security is an issue, the real question in Uzbekistan is affordability. Affordability is worsened, but the other indicators like sustainability, quality, and availability have all stayed good. Yeah. So the critical problem is cost, whereas Uzbekistan and the Uzbek government have done very well in focusing on sustainability, adaptability, and they've thought carefully, and I think they're to be greatly commended for this. They have sought help from international agencies for expertise in those critical areas. It's just that the affordability is actually one of the hardest problems to solve, and it's the one that often causes most distress to people. So in terms of all of those indicators, and that's how we tend to calculate food security, Uzbekistan does very well in availability, quantity and quality and safety, and sustainability and improvement in the environment. It has a challenge in affordability, which is the cost issue. So you will have seen the inflation that goes on here. A lot of food has to be imported for various reasons, and that hits people hard. It's difficult, particularly where incomes, Uzbekistan is moving into that lower middle tier of income, and that's a critical area. Food remains a very substantial part of the family budget.
Okay. As a professor, as a rector, what are the risks in this system, in the world? Maybe how can we integration the system to Uzbekistan? Maybe you have many suggestions about this field. You can speak about.
Well, the risks are real. So Uzbekistan is very keen to improve its yields, improve production capacity, and to export more food. The dangers in exporting more food is, do you leave yourself vulnerable? One of the great historical examples is the Irish famine in the 19th century, where the question was not the availability of food, it's that the English continued to export food from Ireland and left the population short. So the Great Irish Famine is not absolutely about the failure of the potato crop, it's the continued export of food under conditions of lack. So one of the dangers is if you come increasingly to rely on agriculture as a source of foreign exchange income, you may effectively distort the local economy. You make it more expensive. Once you expose yourself to global prices, then your population, in order for agricultural to be competitive, must also pay global prices for food. And that's a danger as things move on. It's not a danger that's impossible to control, but it's something to be aware of as things move forward.
Okay. How is the food safety system developing?
It's a really good question. I've been interested in this area for a very long time, probably 30 odd years I've been sort of thinking this through. We used to think it was a question of money rather than supply. So the thing was, if you didn't distort the market and didn't provide subsidies, there was enough food globally. However, we've started to think supply chain issues, population growth, particularly climate, and the costs of energy. The landscape has become less clear, and it's less clear whether is there an absolute shortage or is it still a market problem. The encouraging and also the sad thing is, if there's no food available or whether you can't afford it, the result is the same. You go hungry, which is a problem. But it's good to know what's the cause so you can address the problem. My sense is, in thinking through this problem and looking at the issues, the question is still not ultimately supply, it's distribution and cost and subsidisation. However, one of the issues that has become increasingly important is food security domestically, the ensuring the ability for a country, by and large, to feed itself. So one of the problems, if you become increasingly reliable on food as an export and you rely on it for income, you may ultimately leave yourself short in terms of food security. So this is a delicate balance about increasing yields, reducing the amount of energy required to produce food, but also market reform, so that those market distortions, and also food wastage, which is a significant problem in Europe and North America, is dealt with. And consumption, overconsumption in developing countries is an issue. All of those things are in the mix now. So I'd like to say there's a clear path through it, but all I can see is that the problem has just become more complex.
Yes.
Which is not much of an answer, I'm afraid, but it's probably where we are.
No, it's good. It's very good. Okay, thank you so much. And maybe the last question is that, actually, what do you think about the Russia and Ukraine war? Maybe what is the worst consequences in the world and especially in Uzbekistan?
Yes, I think there are a number of consequences. One of my area is international relations and international political economy, and I'm constantly impressed by the way in which Uzbekistan manages its international affairs. It's a country which has developed an extraordinary diplomatic capacity. It manages Russia, China, Europe, Afghanistan, the US, Pakistan, India, all of the Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. All of that is one of the most complex international environments that any country faces in an area that's becoming increasingly critical in global affairs. So there's that. The consequences, of course, are for instability in the region, for the relations between Europe and Ukraine and Europe and Russia and the US. It's a very fine line to walk through. In terms of, the danger is, of course, ultimately escalation, nuclear conflict at one end of the spectrum, and the other is simply the degradation of the regional economy over time. That war distorts all sorts of things, fuel prices, water prices, the movement of peoples. It's put pressure on resources within Uzbekistan, it's put pressure on food, it's put pressure on fuel. It's the long-term degradation of some of those systems that is the real danger, I think.
Yes. Actually, we have to learn more and more, and working this field especially, because the food security, actually the food and the maybe the fields are very important for the developing the people and the maybe self-study and another thing.
I think that's an excellent point. One of the things to remember about food and water is they're non-fungible resources. You can't substitute anything for water, and you can't substitute anything for food. The danger is, at least in my view, it has been the industrialisation and commodification of those processes, which means that we may ultimately come out of touch and not be able to sustain ourselves in the most fundamental ways, to feed ourselves, to have good and healthy lives. The other danger, of course, is the shift in patterns of consumption. So one of the things we see as food becomes more expensive is the degradation of the quality of food that we eat. So if you look at the rise of sugar-based soft drinks in Uzbekistan, it's not just Uzbekistan, it's all over the world, but the rise of fast food culture, foods that, the further you move away from traditional diets, the other impact is the health consequences. So it's one of those things, if a country gets its food right, it has all sorts of benefits. In the United States at the moment, for example, type 2 diabetes is so significant. Something like 60 to 80% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. Treating type 2 diabetes in the US could cripple the US economy in the next 20 years. Simply treating that one condition could cripple the American health system because it's so extensive. So we tend not to think of that as a consequence of food security, but it absolutely is. Because the pressure around cost tends to push people to cheap carbohydrate, cheap sugar, which will satisfy hunger in the short term, but then creates downstream a huge range of health problems, which ultimately cost you more money.
Yes, of course. We hope everything will be fine, yes, in the future. So maybe some organizations have to work more and more.
I think so.
Actually, you have seen the project Maksat in Uzbekistan National News Agency. Especially thank you for the Mr. Anthony Jarvis for the interviewing and the maybe giving some interesting and important information, as well as we hope this interview are very useful for some organizations in Uzbekistan.
I hope so too.
Yes, without any doubt. Thank you so much.
It has been a great pleasure.
Yes, thank you. Follow Uzbekistan National News Agency. That's all.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much again.
All right.
Okay. Yaxshi.
Thank you so much. I better not take it with me. It happens from time to time.